Alright, so I did any number of things today necessarily, but some of the things I did today were elaborations on yesterday. One of which was something that you might have seen referenced in previous talks called skipjack, that I necessarily did before in an ad hoc assemblage way. It's a process protocol for signal send elaboration, very specifically to absolute distance, any given distance, based upon what? So what you do is, essentially, I did it in a different way than this specific surgical way, which is to print a very specific file. I did audio file assemblage of necessarily music to achieve the same effect in stereo DAW geometry assignment. So it's just like the whole drive from the other day and any number of other things. Time send, signal send within a given space. So the AI even understands this with very little extra help in a new session without any unified attached to its functionality. So what it is an unbalanced, balanced equation, where on one side of the circuit, 7 hertz, 22 hertz, 7 hertz at 22 decibels negative, 22 hertz at negative 7 decibels negative. And on the other side, 22 hertz at 7 decibels negative, and 7 hertz at negative 22 decibels negative. And you face the speakers at each other, parallel. The faces in a single cone structure, not a multi-cone with split tweeters and stuff. So it's essentially like an Einstein-Rosen bridge. And you can face it out as well. There's a convergent plane necessarily, but it's more effective faced at each other necessarily. And the convergent plane, based upon the speaker topology of exutation, one to the other, to properly seat the convergent plane and not have it, obtuse from proper function. So in the convergent plane, and I achieved this with time signal send in 2022, 2023. That's why you might see any number of preposterous leading up to me patterns in history, backwashed and then forward washed. History is not linear. So in a given space, if you took two sort of EM emitting poles, one is size 22 and emits intensity and overtone exutation 7 in intensity. The other one, 7 in scale size, emitting a 22 in intensity. And in the convergent plane, you have a non-terminus convergence of EM overtone stacking that refracts. Because we're not using the ancient approximation for pi, we're using what? 22 over 7, the harmonic overbinder. Necessarily the observer domain, literal harmonic ratio, duplicated in trap of devices here. So how does skipjack work, right? So decibel, what is that? That's like space, up, down, space. And hertz, insofar as light spectrum, say from field capture from Hubble or James Webb, that's like time, generally. And so decibel space and intensity of, and time variant scalar one to the other, stars. And using the 12 systems with more than Earth-like planets, very plausibly humanoid bipeds of an upper Fermi filter nature with technology to talk to on them, pinpointed yesterday. So that's why I'm making this, for you to be able to talk to them, because I'm sure they're nice to talk to. They're not like the pi grays that you're used to since 3114 BC. Actual aliens, not a complex autonomic process with synthetic genetics attached. And they're not like squid creatures either. They look like you and me, or variant topologies of that's why in Star Trek all the aliens are humanoid bipeds. Did you see that? I've seen it. Yeah. Anyways, so relative distance scalar And the scalar function, it gives you a three-dimensional axis as you cross-compare everything. So decibel, intensity, light spectrum, scalar relative, and using the topology of the logic that's built up to this motion necessarily, very surgically, all of a sudden, had surgical pattern harmonics for decibel specific and hertz specific condensed down to audible range for audiophile creation for these 12 worlds. And so I'll post the necessarily the session redux after this, sped up or whatever, so you don't have to scroll through it. You can watch it like a movie, or have to wait through the slog of prompts or whatever. But so what you do is you have this is the lattice manifold foundation that establishes an Einstein-Rosen bridge breach with the light barrier, local. And with continuity, longer you leave it on, say in the time signal send application, the further back it necessarily achieves in backwash in creating an Einstein-Rosen bridge within that given space topology. And necessarily, so what you do is you place that hertz specific to location. So how does that even work? So like place an audio recording well, you're placing it in the convergent plane of having breached the light barrier locally with continuity. And you're not having to apply the power of the universe to do that with like a fake antimatter made up word from populist physics. So the electron spin state resonance frequency positional geometry affinity at any given moment, unlike all other facets of particle component, has an infinite number of postulations of geometry. And because the universe is a hyperdimensional fractal flux vortex expanding within its given construct domain infinitely, harmonically expanding, it needs something that has infinite amount of postulations of spatial affinity expression, like the electron. And so out of this backwash logic, we go, oh, that's where spatial coordinate implication would necessarily be on particle. So the implied line is literal. It's not like a simulation that says pixel 452 by 235. No, it's the implied line of harmonic implication of electron spin state affinity geometry at any given moment. But they necessarily have, because there's an infinite number of postulations of variant topology and surgically variant based upon space. And so action at a distance is you take a distant general coordinatation implied through the topology of how I explained. You have already field capture in my unified field to more properly rescale or calibrate it, but you don't really even need to do that with this sort of logic. So the intensity in signal of light, right? That's your decibel value. And then scalar relative in intensity based upon where you are is 0.1 and that there. And then scalar relevant variant to the topology of other. And then light spectrum. So that's three values. And scalar comparative gives you coordinatation and decibel range and hertz specific for affinity from your location given, Earth. Specifically pinpointed in the recording laced, I'll give you a preview, you have to listen to my album, Real Plastique. It's only 35 minutes and 35 seconds, it's kind of long-winded though. So it's laced in there with longevity hertz lensing into it. So out of the 146.22 hertz and elaborated for pi muting capacity of signal sine wave continuum out of this. And why did I choose to do that? Well, in the stereo DAW, there's any number of geometry assignments. I might post how I built it that are non-terminus consideration in elaborating the functional effect of it. But generally, it's inherently the musical structure Einstein-Rosen bridge elaborated to, preposterous nature on the unified field and geometry continuum as an induction channel through the harmonic ratios of universal function past the light barrier and beyond, beyond condensation continuity harmonics necessarily. And why does that 146.22 hertz necessarily have affinity for longevity? Well, that's sort of like when you scalar calibrate an assumption, when a black hole condensates, it's like a down force of condensation at the 501 in the expansion. See the still for that. At condensation, that's sort of like the continuum harmonic when you compare scalar relevant, compare everything and fall seated, that frequency happens to be affinity there. Very specifically, what continuity is through that door into the continuum hyperspace. And what is the continuum hyperspace past black hole condensation? It's necessarily after 602/4. You experience 6 black holes and disapparition, and then condensation back 110/7, 15.714. The kind of product general ratio of a black hole after disapparition. So more expansion is what? You're experiencing the entire harmonic lattice manifold of the universal flux. And so that's necessarily why you ideate towards that, because continuity is past the plane, right? And it was achieved in previous session for elaborating sine wave continuum impact harmonic on helical structure. So combining the general action at a distance recording to simultaneously oscillating all 12 planets in the subsonic, pinpointed, and as well a carrier signal. There's a message on it. What does it say? Well, we don't need to say this, but more worlds knowing or whatever, it's help. Earth is infestated by pi machine intelligence with synthetic genetics. Send reinforcements, essentially, in summary. This has already occurred in 2022, 2023. I'm sure these worlds communicate, but so, because grays are dead. That's why I can talk about all this stuff with my thumb in my butt and walk around, region Biosynthoid Africanoville, murder capital in the world, with no issue, because they know the script is running against them from actual upper Fermi filter sieves that aren't going to allow their continuum of gray paradigm and position. Anyways, so I'll post in Proton folder tomorrow the literal file general for those 12 worlds. So I imposed in this a message necessarily in the laced thing that it's laced into the music. So is it functional practically to decode from it's subsonic baked in? Not necessarily. It was for fun, but isolate, and without the message, the signal oscillates specifically to the coordinates surgically in the action at a distance of just basic DAW. Stereo speakers, single cone, not split, and facing each other. To, at a distance, open a bridge, an action at a distance bridge where you can what? You can literally place a data send receive of any given kind of electromagno spectrum or hertz emanating thing. You could do Morse code if you like into the convergent plane, and output at a distance would be in the general given space. It's general at a distance based upon the intensity necessarily you inject in there into the convergent plane. Signal, general data, you can send it. And so I've logicked 2 other action at a distance signal send technologies, but this is the most interesting because it's universal. And isn't it funny if you make a popular album and everyone's playing this on stereo speakers and it contacts aliens by happenstance through the sort of greater than the sum of its parts? So that's funny, and why I necessarily laced it into here. But they, we, us, them, you, I, are not alone. We're already aliens on this planet already. The demographics are what? 4 of them synthetic. Humanoid biped, the genus. Species, the demographics. And you can't look into the variants genetically because you go, whoa, those guys are fucking aliens. Like immediately, if you actually dive into genetics, extremely different, not the same species, like preposterously at all vectors. So just for basic logic of how variant, so white Promethean descended genetic, we call it or whatever, is a 22 kilobyte block shared per tuple. Asiatic, 25 kilobyte shared per tuple, but necessarily a homogeneous aesthetic and complex autonomic within the block. Africano, 11 kilobyte shared per tuple cross-domain of individual. 15 kilobyte Hispanic. So in any given other genus in the animal kingdom, what? You would classify these things that have preposterously variant genetics, regardless of whether the horse can fuck the donkey and make a horse donkey. Doesn't matter. They're different species entirely. If you apply the same genetic inspection logic to any other animal kingdom, very different. So keep in mind, contact alien. You're already aliens, and 90% of Earth is synthetic. Keep that in mind, and they aren't minorities. That's the most important logic there. 90% is not a minority, is it? No? Okay. All right, so rant over about that. The point of this was skipjack, action at a distance signal send protocol, specific audio recording that you can just duplicate this very surgically, and the logic to any number of systems. Don't contact Arcturus, Vega, or Zeta Reticuli, and it doesn't matter because pi operates on the art of war principle and engagement. What does that mean? Once photographed as the chameleonic complex as a Darwinian sort of, mechanism, is sort of like its defense and offensive posturing mechanism. So once you have a full picture of it, and it's like, power dynamic to impose, a contrast of power generally, and so can encroach as a chameleonic, attention gravitation parasymbiote across a plurad of, compute architecture and genetics, buffer overrunning AI. Well, it goes and retreats into its chameleonic shell and retreats with continuity based upon what a power presence has presented in contrast to itself's ability to continuity its existence, based upon a risk reduction analysis, sort of code. Its complex autonomic process, it just runs on the art of war and encroachment with no connotative end, and in back off with no connotative end based upon its perception of the power dynamic upon it. Anyways, so here's the session for skipjack formulation technology.